Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the You Flourish podcast. We are so excited to be back, and today I'm here with a special guest, Trina. And Trina is, I honestly have just had the privilege to just meet her. And the first time I talked to her on the phone, I thought, wow, this woman has the most energy I've ever met, but she just has so much joy to bring. And through her struggles that she's been through and through the pain she's experienced, I think that she brings just a lot of wisdom. And I think she can share so much joy with us. And so I'm excited to have this conversation with her today. So, Trina, why don't you start off by first I need to say thank you for being here, but also start off by just telling us more about you, what you do, and your journey. And so share as much as you want, but we're all here to listen.
Well, thank you, Grace. Oh, excuse me. Well, I'm excited to be here too. So, just a little bit about me. I am a senior professional, and I work full time, and I have my kids 50% of the time. So, I liken it to kind of when you're running. Like I'm running on the week when I have my kids. Then when you take that little break for walking, and then you come back, and then you remember how hard running is again. So I sort of have that start stop. But I work full time. I've got my kids, and about 5.5 years ago is when I had gone through the divorce, which really came as a shock to me. It happened quite quickly and was really the hardest thing that I had gone through in my life so far, and just has really helped me grow as a person.
Mm. So I think what I really want to focus on talking about today is your journey through your divorce, like you just mentioned, because that is something that I think no one wants to find themselves in, but many people do. And I would just love to really just dive into that and I hear about your story. And first, I mean, how did this divorce one impact your faith? Um, because I think that it can shake our faith when something comes out of nowhere and to trust that God has a plan. So I'd love to hear that part of the story.
Yeah, and I think we say, oh, it comes out of nowhere, right? There were many years leading up to it. And it just was, I think you just don't think it will happen. And it did. And how it impacted my faith, I can tell you the moment that I walked out of the counselor's office, I was in the downtown area of the town in which I live. And I just was like, I can't go home. I can't go home. I can't look at the children. I don't want to see the nanny. Um, I don't know. I can't go home. We had driven there separately. And so he left to go home. And I thought, well, I am certainly not hungry, you know. And secondly, I don't think that going to go drink is probably going to be the way that I want to handle this and look back. And I looked over and I saw the steeple of a church in town. And so I knew that they had a chapel that was open 24/7. And so I walked into that chapel and I just cried. I went into the choir loft and I just was like, Lord, I have no idea how I am going to do this. This is half of my life that's going to be gone. I had spent nearly half of my life with him. I had I knew that I would lose time with my children, and I knew financially too, like what had happened, and I just didn't know what the path was. And it was in that moment that I felt like I had no idea how I was going to be okay, but yet I knew I was going to be okay. And just in this like depth and just this extreme consolation. So I didn't have like a turning away of faith at that point, and I consider that a very great gift. And then once I started telling people, people would ask me, what do you need and what can I do to help you? And I couldn't quite articulate, but I knew there were three things. I said, number one, pray that my children are going to be okay. And I said, number two, pray that I can concentrate at work because I still need to, because I need to keep my job. And I said, number three, pray that I do not harden my heart. And those were the three things that I had asked for as I was going through the divorce.
Mm,
But I didn't have a like turning away from God, like in that sense of like, why did you abandon me? Like I never had that. Um, but yeah, I took it as a time to like lean in further.
mhm. So when it comes to you asking people to pray for you and pray for all these different things, sometimes I think it can be really hard to ask for that. So how did you go about asking people to pray for you? And because sometimes it comes off, some people I think are afraid to ask for the help. How did you do that? And how did you go about all those conversations?
Going through a divorce creates a lot of humility, right? Like
Mm,
all of a sudden, and you feel like you're on the stage. The whole world knows your primary relationship, the one that you made the covenant to say that you're staying together forever, is gone, right? So there's like the level of embarrassment is already there, like just in the fact that you're getting divorced. And so people want to help. And I always believe that, like, that there's always a goodness within people and they always do want to help. And so when I never like went around and said, pray for me, pray for me, pray for me, right? Like
mhm,
it was when people asked me for help because I didn't know what else I need. I didn't know what physical things I needed as those, and it's such a time too of like it's it's so vulnerable, right? And so it was my
mhm,
closest friends who had come to move his stuff out. I mean, like, that's not something that you're at business after hours, right? And they say,
mhm,
"Oh, how can I help?" It like, "Hey, how are you doing?" "Oh, I'm going through a divorce." "Oh, how can I help you?" "Hey, want to come over and move out my ex-husband's stuff?" Like, you don't ask that,
mhm,
but you can ask for prayers, right? And
mhm,
I live in a community that still has like a Christian center, I would say. And
mhm,
even if a Buddhist would ask you to pray for them or to send good thoughts, right? Like I, there's not an offense that would be taken, I think. So I
mhm,
think it's just when people ask if you need prayer, you can just ask for prayers.
mhm. Well, when it comes to dealing with all these other people in your life, I mean, like you said, you're the center of attention. It feels like when you go through a divorce, and it seems like everyone's in your business and knows everything that's going on. How did you not let those voices get to you, or not let that negativity, or the maybe the ideas and the rumors that probably were out there, who knows, get to you about what happened from other people?
Ooh, well, it did get to me, right? Like I
Mhm,
think, it did. You feel like you're on center stage, but you're not, and it can feel that way. I was super fortunate. A year before, a little over a year before I got divorced, my father had passed away, and my mom had done something called Beginning Experience. And so it was a divorced and widowed support group. So I knew
mhm,
when I got divorced, and I know it's funny, I do things in three, right? Like I knew three things. Number one, I was going to do a week in a condo on a beach in Florida all by myself. And I didn't know when, but I knew that I needed to do that. Number two, that I was going to do beginning experience. And then number three, I'm Catholic. And so I knew I wanted to go through the annulment process so that I could go through that healing and also be able to know how does the rest of my life look like. So those were the three things. I think I stayed focused. Journaling was so huge. I went to the counselor weekly, like, because I
mhm,
needed to. Like, if I would have tried to do it on my own, I wouldn't have been able to silence those voices.
mhm. I think it's so important though, like you're saying, to just not be ashamed because all of this stuff, like more people go through this stuff than we even can imagine. And so don't be ashamed if you need to go to counseling. Don't need, be ashamed if you need to take that time just to yourself. And so I actually want to ask you a question about the trip that you took by yourself.
Yeah.
Um, Tell me more about that whole experience and what that was like for you. Because personally, if someone were to tell me right now to go on a trip by myself, I would probably lose my mind because like I just like that gives me so much anxiety thinking about doing that. So tell me about that trip and like how it was healing for you or what that brought up for you.
It was interesting. There was one of my coworkers who had gone through a divorce about a year before me. And I had said, I don't know. I just feel like I need to do this trip. And she's like, you do. And so I did. I traveled quite a bit for work. So traveling alone, like the idea of driving to an airport alone, being on a plane alone, like that was, I was accustomed to it. I also wanted so badly to be somewhere where nobody knew who I was. Nobody knew
Mm,
that I no longer had the ring on my finger. For all they knew, I never had one in my life.
mm,
And so that was really important to me. So I just flew to Florida. I rented a condo on the beach. And I actually went to both coasts. I knew I wanted to go to the Salvador Dali Museum. Um, and I had been there before with some other people. Nobody else wanted to really go. So I knew, hey, I'm going to go do this. So I took that little trip. And then I slept a ton, and I slept and slept and slept, and then I would drink wine in the morning and coffee at night. Like, I didn't, like, drink myself, for the week, right? But it just was like, I just allowed the chaos to be, right? And to just do whatever I felt like. I had no responsibilities, and I did a lot of sleeping because I was actually just so exhausted. But to feel in the sun and to be alone and to just know that it's going to be okay. And I had written in my journal at that time, wow, being alone doesn't mean that you are lonely. And I actually had felt more lonely in my marriage than I did spending a week alone.
mm. That is such a powerful this phrase. Like I wrote that down. Being alone doesn't mean you're lonely. I think that loneliness is something that we all are experiencing right now, especially just with like our world and the things that we're all going through. I mean, how did you work through that? Just that in general, like loneliness, but like what does that mean? It was different. It's loneliness probably felt yeah, like different in your marriage than it did like when you were outside of your marriage. And like how have you dealt with now this new life of being on your own technically, like how have you dealt with all those emotions or like tell me more about the emotions that you went through.
Oh, shame,
Mhm.
shame. And I'm not sure who said it. I'm assuming anything that I know about shame, I've learned from Brene Brown, right?
Mhm.
Um, but shame can't live in light. And loneliness, the actual feeling of loneliness is a fruit of being unseen, unknown, unheard.
Mhm.
And so when you're going through a very difficult time, regardless of whatever that difficult time is, it's imperative that you remind yourself of light, right? Bring the light in, open the door. People want to be there for you, and you need to be humble enough to accept their help and genuine enough to know that they're genuine in that. So,
Mhm.
um, working through the emotions just takes a lot. I mean, it's a lot of crying, it's a lot of anger. It's like I remember I had gotten this book and I was like, I'm going to go through this book and then I'm going to be fine and then it's going to all be good. And it's not. And it's like, there are layers, like there are so many layers. Even 5.5 years later, there sometimes are these little, I don't know, I just call them like these little pricks, right? Of like, ooh, oh, wow, that's a remembered pain. Oh, that
Mhm.
was a layer that I haven't dealt with. So honestly, like for me, it was a lot of supportive family, supportive friends, a wonderful counselor, um, and just an acceptance, support groups. Those things were the ways that I worked through it.
Mhm. Yeah, I think it's important to remember that there's no quick fix when it comes to something like that. Like, we can't just say, "Oh, I'm gonna be better by the snap of our fingers," because we read a book or we took that trip. Like, yes, it was probably one of the most impactful things for you, but that doesn't mean you're just gonna be better when you get back because you have to come back to the same stuff when you return.
Yeah,
Um,
you remind me, Grace, of I looked back at one of my journals, and this was I still journal. This was not too long ago, and I was just reflecting on life, and I wrote the line, time is a gentle healer.
mm,
And there is nothing that you can do to rush it. Time is time. And I remember too, my counselor, so Thursdays are always the last night that I have the kids. So they
mhm,
exchange days on Friday. And so on Thursday nights, I'd put the kids to bed and then I would just cry. Like I just hated Thursdays. And I asked my counselor, what should I do? Like, what should I do? Should I call friends? Should I do this? Should I do that? Should I do this? And she said, cry. And I was
mm,
like, that's it? Like, I'm just supposed to sit there and feel this? And she's like, yup. And I did. And then I don't know at what moment, what week it was, at what point in time, eventually that became the new normal. And I
mhm,
don't cry on Thursday nights anymore. I keep Thursday nights, I try to, as much as I can, keep them very sacred, right? Like, and I think that's part of like when you have a bi-nuclear home with your children, that it becomes these more intentional times. Like on
mhm,
Friday nights, we really don't do things that's our coming back together. And Thursday nights, I try not to do things either. And that's what you gotta do and understand that it's always a season. For my whole life, it's not gonna be every Friday, it's not gonna be every
mm,
Thursday. But then when you start calculating some of these things out, I just, my daughter is 12 and I don't remember what the math was, but I said to my friends, like, oh my gosh, this is the number of Fridays that I have left with her before she
mhm,
graduates. And it's like, it wasn't that much. You know what I mean? What's 26 times six? That's about like
mhm,
what it is. And so I think it gives you more of a reality too of like this is the time that you have. Um Also, being able to work in an environment where the whole person is accepted is incredibly important. I had just the support of, hey, I'm not traveling. Like I can only
mhm,
travel during these times, right? Like I can't have the hectic schedule that I had before. And so, yeah, it's just making sure that you have a support system too all
mhm,
around. And I say journaling for me, a lot of my prayer is journaling. And so that's really when I talk to God. I going to a chapel to pray is something that is really I feel closer, right? Especially, during certain times when the church has special prayer times and stuff. But yeah, it's time, it's a gentle healer and staying
mhm,
open.
mm. When you reminded me of too is you said that how shame cannot live in light, and when you're going through a difficult time, remind yourself of the light. It all goes back to reminding yourself of and just being grateful for like what you do get. And like you said, now those Thursday nights have become one of the best nights of the week, probably because you're like, this is my last day I get with them for the weekend. And like, but you get to make that such a fun and wonderful day rather than you making it what used to be the negative, like focusing on the positive always when it's so hard. And I'm sure forever it was the hardest thing in the world to focus on the good. But once you find that, it's like holding on to that good as hard as you possibly can and not letting go. Because I think that's how you get through something like that.
Yeah, and you remind me, Grace, of gratitude, right? That was such a huge practice for me too. And so after I got divorced, this was my day. My day was I would like get the kids to school, I would work, I would, it was run from thing to thing to thing, get the kids to bed. They were still very young when I had gotten divorced. My son wasn't even 3, right? So I had
Mm.
early bedtimes. And then I sat on the couch and I cried. And that's just what I did because it was just like everything, like I had to keep myself together all day. And then it was like that was my time to fall apart. And I don't know, it was maybe like 6 weeks after I got divorced, and my daughter was coming off of the soccer field and out. It had rained earlier in the day. And I remember I was like, there's gonna not be soccer practice. I'm not gonna have to take her there, like,
Mm-hmm.
and we had soccer practice, and off in the distance, there was a double rainbow. And my daughter was 6 at the time, and she walked off the field and said to me, "Wow, mom, look at that beautiful, rare moment." And it was that night after I put the kids to bed that I sat down on my couch, and instead of crying, I had this thought, wait a second. I think you can make a Shutterfly book off of your Instagram posts, right? This was like a while ago. And even though I'm in technology, I'm like super savvy in business technology, but other technology maybe is not my thing. I had like 10 followers, right? Like no big deal. And so then I was like, great, nobody's going to know this. And every day I'm just going to take a picture and I'm going to write what I'm grateful for. And I did
Mm-hmm.
that. And that was something that was like a great exercise. Well, then I started getting more followers. Then I wound up, doing some speaking and doing those sorts of things. And it is, it is important to know that beauty can be harvested from the broken. And so I look at, like when you say Grace, when you said she's full of energy and joy, if
Mm-hmm.
you would have known me 7 years ago, I don't know that that would be the way that you would have described me. Um, or if I was that, it wasn't overflowing from within me. But so anyway,
Mm-hmm.
so now I have this thing, gratitude nirvana, right? Like I'm on Instagram and that sort of thing. I don't have a ton of followers, which is fine. I've gotten away from that practice and I need to get back to it, but it was something that was so healing for me.
Mm-hmm.
So you can just make a private account, right? And do it, keep it for yourself.
Yeah, I think that, and it is gratitude can really, honestly, truly solve anything. Some days, like all you need to do is focus on what are you grateful for today. There's always something. Like there's always something, even if it's for like literally, I don't know, the most simplest things. Like there's something to be grateful for. And so I guess I have 2 more questions I want to ask you, and you maybe touched on this, but I kind of want to like just get your last full opinion. But if you were to, meet someone who's gone through something similar to you, whether it is a divorce or something that completely changed the trajectory of their life, what would be the one piece of advice you would give them in, especially like in their faith and how they can lean into God? Like, what would be your number one piece of advice for them?
Listen in the silence.
Mm,
That's what I would say.
mm,
It's
that's beautiful.
in the silence that I have had the greatest messages and consolations for
Mm.
myself.
I do agree with that in the sense that we are always consumed by something. Like consumed by whatever it is, and we move from listening to music to watching TV to looking at our phones, looking at our computers, to even talking to people. We're constantly consumed with something, and God will speak to us as soon as we stop.
Hmm.
And I think that's so important that we just remember that
I think,
He's
oh, well,
waiting for
also
us to
listen in the
listen.
silence. I got a second one too, is like pay attention because he's speaking to you through others.
Mm, I love that.
So, like, I had this example of like, there was this spiritual book that three people in a like a 2 week period were like, "Hey, Trina, have you read this book? Hey, Trina, have you read this book?" And I, including somebody who was like no longer like living a Christian life. And I was like, okay, well, okay, God, like I'm getting the hint. Like you want me to do that. Julia
Mm,
Cameron talks about the synchronicity within her book, The Artist's Way. That was a
mhm.
very healing thing too that I had done. Just a wonderful book. And the synchronicity, is when you just kind of put that in the secular term, right? Synchronicity, you translate that, and that's the Holy Spirit. And the Holy Spirit's
Yeah,
always at work, and he's at work within all of us.
yes. I love that because I think that's happened to me more than I would like to admit, and I just literally, as you said that, I was like, "Hmm." I've had people tell, like, when you're like, "Oh, gosh, I've heard that a lot lately," or every time you get in the car, the same song is playing on the radio. Well, hmm, like, maybe that's God trying to tell me something. I don't know, but, I think it's important to remember. I was just talking to someone about this, about how it's not gonna be an epiphany. Usually, it's not gonna be this, like, "Oh my gosh, huge thing that's gonna happen, that's gonna change your whole entire life," but it's in the little things, and, like, listening in the silence, and also, yeah, just paying attention, because God is gonna speak to you through maybe some interesting ways that you would never expect.
Well, yeah,
But
and it goes into, in the Bible, right? The hands, the feet, like we're all parts of the
Mhm.
body and we're all different parts of the body. And so it's important that not only is it there that time alone, but there's also the time in community and fellowship.
Mhm. Exactly. Yes. Well, we're running out of time, but I want to ask you one last question, and this is one of my favorite questions because I love to hear the reasoning behind everyone's answers. But I would love to hear, if you have a favorite Bible verse you would share with us, and why, and like where this came from, and why it's your favorite.
Well, I went on a hermitage and I had just this experience where there was something that was like, it was somebody who was in another hermitage and had left something behind because he heard, this is not for me, this is for someone else. And that object, and then also had written this verse. And so it was just a way like that God was really speaking to me, and on that retreat. And so it's from Ephesians 1:18, and it was, so that with the eyes of your heart enlightened, you may know what is the hope to which he has called you, what are the riches of his glorious inheritance among the saints. I was going through just this period of time of like, writing and asking like, when is my happiness coming? Like, when is my stuff coming? Right. And to then have that like delivered to me in such a tangible way, um, is that it was like, okay, so my eyes of the heart must be enlightened, right? So that I can know the hope for which he has called me, and
Mm,
that it is glorious and more beautiful than you can possibly imagine. And this also ties into a few months earlier when I had been in some silent time and prayer. I always take a journal with me, right? And I was going through just kind of like a difficult time, and had written, Lord, what do you want me to do? And it just came, and it was, be patient, love yourself, and it will be more beautiful than you can possibly imagine. And so it was like that verse then tied with what had just I had written, several months ago, which was something that I continually told myself, that's what makes it my favorite verse.
Mm, that's so beautiful. And that story is so wonderful how someone just thought this isn't for me, this is for someone else. And it's so cool how God works in those ways and that we it's so above us and so beyond what we can even imagine. And I just think that's one of the coolest things. And that's why it takes faith to know that it's our brains aren't made to even comprehend that, but God made it that way because he knows that that's okay. He's gonna work in such crazy ways. But oh well, Trina, thank you so much for sharing that. Thank you so much for being with me today and having this conversation with me. This was so wonderful. And I'll put some info about Trina in the show notes and some of the things that she shared with. So I'll give you some resources there. But thanks you all for tuning in, listening today. And Trina, thanks so much for joining.
Well, thank you, Grace. It's a pleasure.